The sound of 6 Japanese fighters echoed through the sky, their engines roaring as they circled, waiting for the kill. Below, a lone B-25 bomber limped through the air, its wings battered and one engine trailing smoke. The crew braced for impact. They knew their chances of survival were slim. But Captain Jay Zeamer Jr. had something in mind that no one expected. As the planes closed in, Zeamer throttled back. He slowed his bomber, bringing it dangerously close to a stall. This calculated move wasn't instinctual. It was the product of months of research, analysis, and observation. He didn't think of it as heroism, but rather a simple application of physics. Zeamer knew that the Zeros, the faster and more agile Japanese fighters, relied on speed and timing. By slowing down at just the right moment, Zeamer could disrupt their attack runs, throwing off their timing and leaving them open to fire. It worked. The first Zero shot passed, confused by the unexpected move. Zeamer's crew opened fire, scoring a hit on the fighter, sending it spiraling out of control. But this wasn't luck. It was a calculated trick, something Zeamer had been working on for months. He'd studied Japanese tactics, learning their approach, timing, and weaknesses. He had realized that if the enemy pilots couldn't predict their target's movements, they'd lose their advantage. Zeamer wasn't the typical fighter pilot. He didn't fit the mold of the bold, aggressive, cocky pilot often glorified in combat. He wasn't fearless, and he wasn't a natural-born daredevil. Instead, he was meticulous, thoughtful, and perhaps most importantly, logical. While many pilots relied on instinct, Zeamer relied on calculations and probabilities. Born in 1918 in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, Jay Zeamer Jr. was far from the typical image of a war hero. He was tall and thin, often referred to as the Bookworm by his crew because of his constant reading. His obsession wasn't just limited to aviation. Zeamer devoured anything that could improve his understanding of flight and tactics. He studied the enemy's methods, learned about their aircraft, and analyzed every report he could get his hands on. He even went so far as to read translated Japanese flight manuals. Zeamer's crew didn't understand him at first. The other pilots were cocky, instinctive, aggressive. Everything Zeamer was not. While they gambled their lives on bold moves, Zeamer calculated every step he took. His superiors didn't know what to make of him. He wasn't a natural leader. He wasn't the type to take charge in a way that inspired others. Instead, Zeamer was methodical, and his superiors saw him as too cautious for the role of a leader. His first few assignments were uneventful. He bounced around from squadron to squadron, filling in for sick crew members or flying co-pilot missions. No one wanted him in command. They saw him as a spare part, someone useful enough to keep around but too odd to promote. Yet Zeamer kept flying, kept learning, and kept improving his skills. His crew began to notice something different about him. They noticed how calm he was, even in the most dangerous situations. When others panicked, Zeamer stayed focused. When an engine caught fire over the Bismarck Sea, when flak tore a hole through the plane, Zeamer didn't scream or act rashly. Instead, he narrated the problems aloud, like a surgeon calling out instruments. "Oil pressure dropping," he'd say. "Altitude loss at 200 feet per minute. Trim compensating." His crew found this unsettling at first. It was as if Zeamer didn't feel fear. He wasn't showing the usual signs of distress. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He wasn't reacting in a way that made sense to others. But what his crew didn't understand was that Zeamer's calmness wasn't a lack of emotion. It was control. He didn't panic because he had already planned for every contingency. He wasn't reacting to the situation as it unfolded. He had already decided what to do. By 1943, Zeamer had flown more than 40 missions, and his reputation was beginning to shift. His commanders still didn't know what to do with him, but they couldn't deny his effectiveness. He had survived mission after mission, and though he wasn't the typical fighter pilot, he was still alive, and his crew was too. In a war where survival rates were low and bomber losses were high, that made Zeamer's quiet, analytical approach invaluable. But Zeamer wasn't satisfied. He had noticed patterns in the way the Japanese attacked, especially when American bombers were targeted by Zeros. He saw that after the bombing run, when bombers were heading home, the Zeros would typically attack from behind. The bombers couldn't outrun them. The fighters would target the tail section where the bombers couldn't defend themselves. Zeamer started wondering, what if he could change the rules? What if, instead of trying to outrun the enemy or dogfight with them, he could disrupt their attack? What if he could use timing, not speed, as his weapon? He began to experiment with small adjustments. By slowing down just before a Zero engaged, Zeamer observed that the Japanese pilots couldn't react quickly enough. The Zero, with all its speed and maneuverability, couldn't catch a bomber that changed its speed at the last second. Zeamer's thinking wasn't wild or reckless. It was simple physics. The faster you're going, the harder it is to slow down or change direction. But if you suddenly reduce your speed when the enemy expects you to accelerate, you could create a window of opportunity. At first, Zeamer kept this idea to himself. His superiors dismissed it as a reckless maneuver. Slowing down in the middle of a combat situation seemed insane. It violated every rule they had learned. But Zeamer didn't care about the rules. He wasn't interested in doing what everyone else did. He was interested in finding a way to survive. June 16, 1943, would test everything Zeamer had been thinking. The mission was a suicide run. Fly to Bougainville, photograph the enemy airfields and shipping lanes, and return. No fighter escorts, no backup. The odds were slim, but Zeamer and his crew trusted him. They knew he wouldn't let them waste their lives recklessly. The mission was voluntary, but they all volunteered, knowing they could trust Zeamer's calculations. They flew out at dawn, the sea below them black and endless. The morning air was thick with tension. There was no radio chatter except for the occasional crackle of static. The crew was quiet, focused on the task at hand. Zeamer kept his attention on the skies, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the Zeros. When the first Zero appeared, it rose from below, fast and deadly, but Zeamer stayed calm. He wasn't surprised. He had expected it. The Zeros appeared, one by one, each dive more terrifying than the last. But Zeamer didn't react in panic. He slowed down, letting the first Zero fly right past him. His gunners opened fire. The first Zero was hit, spiraling out of control. The other Zeros hesitated. They had never seen a bomber behave like this before. Zeamer had broken their attack rhythm. He did it again, and every time the Zeros overshot. They couldn't predict his moves. They couldn't keep up. Zeamer had taken control of the situation, not by speeding up or running away, but by disrupting their expectations. The Japanese pilots were confused. Nothing about this mission was following the usual script. They weren't used to bombers slowing down while under attack. This wasn't part of the playbook. Zeros relied on speed, and Zeamer had disrupted that. As the attack continued, he began to make small adjustments, varying his speed, changing his altitude, and altering his flight path by just a few degrees. Every time the Zeros tried to come in for another attack, Zeamer would alter his tactics again. The Japanese pilots couldn't figure out how to engage. Their attacks became erratic, uncertain. They were losing fuel, wasting energy, and they couldn't predict what Zeamer would do next. Zeamer didn't stop there. He kept his crew focused, calm, just like him. His bombardier took photos of the enemy targets, and the crew completed their task despite the constant threat of death. By the time they crossed into Allied airspace, 4 of the 6 Zeros had been driven off. 2 others were confirmed damaged. Zeamer landed the plane on one engine, skidding it to a stop on the muddy runway. It wasn't a perfect landing. The plane was barely in one piece, but they had completed their mission, and they were alive. The crew climbed out of the bomber, bruised, bloody, but still standing. They had survived. In the days that followed, Zeamer was awarded the Medal of Honor for his bravery. His bombardier received the Distinguished Service Cross, and the rest of the crew was also honored for their heroism. But the official reports didn't mention the throttle trick. They didn't mention Zeamer's calculated maneuver, which had disrupted the enemy attack and saved his crew. Pilots across the Pacific began talking about Zeamer's tactic. They didn't call it the Zeamer maneuver. They didn't need to. They simply began to experiment with it. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but it was effective enough to start changing the way pilots approached combat. By the end of 1943, the survival rate for bombers had improved by 4%. It might sound small, but that 4% meant hundreds of lives saved. Zeamer had made the difference. His tactics were taught in flight schools, passed down through word of mouth. But Zeamer never sought fame. He didn't want to be a hero. He just wanted to find a way to survive. And in doing so, he gave his crew, and hundreds of others, a chance to come home. The lesson Zeamer taught wasn't about raw speed or strength. It was about timing, disruption, and calculation. Zeamer may have been overlooked by many, but his legacy lives on. The smartest move is not always the fastest, and sometimes the unexpected can save your life.